One of the most famous anti-colonial actions ever was led by women in the Bamenda grassfields of Cameroon in 1958. It was called the Anlu, or Common Women's Rebellion, where protesting women literally ground the then British colony to a halt. Women employed the centuries-old practice of public shaming or naked resistance. But the Anlu Rebellion didn't come out of nowhere, even though British colonial officers at the time seemed genuinely taken by surprise. In fact, women's resistance in Cameroon took a few forms leading up to the Anlu Rebellion. To understand just how, we need to go back to 1884, when German ships arrived in Douala to claim Cameroon as a protectorate. Germany was the first European colonizer of Cameroon, and colonial officials took no real interest in actually understanding how Cameroonian power structures worked or the interactions between men and women. It was assumed that, just like in Europe, women were subservient to men. That wasn't really the case, especially in the Com community, according to historian Confidence Ngam, professor of political and diplomatic history at the University of Bamenda.
Patriarchy will just mean that men have been given the authority to lead. And I said given, not that they had just usurped. It's not like women were relegated just to the yards of child production and other things. The organization of first of all, we must note that the patriarchal system obeys the role of women. Succession even goes in that matrilineal clan. And women, especially the Queen Mother, occupied a place of authority and of consultation when important decisions concerning the traditional administrations were to be made. Though they did not sit with men in the same meetings to provide the consultancy, they were always consulted, and they were custodians of most traditional moral values.
German colonialism, though, rode roughshod over all traditional customs. The introduction of the exploitative plantation work and the migration of men to build colonial infrastructure, for instance, changed gender dynamics.
What animated the German economy was the issue of labor, especially in the plantations that were open in the coast. And given that the grass field acted like a threshold where most of this labor was gotten, a good lot of women found their husbands being shipped away to the German plantations. And so the first level of protest was a refusal by women that their husbands will not be able to participate in providing the labor, especially the plantation labor that the Germans wanted. And secondly, a distortion in the family circle to make sure that the children or those who are already grown that could provide those who were to be enlisted in the police troop and the Schutztrupp.
So even though the Germans were forced to relinquish their African colonies after the First World War, their regime had fundamentally changed the way of life for Cameroonian men and women. In a sense, aspects of daily life and labor had become almost Europeanized. Spiritually speaking, the role of the church and Christianity took on a more prominent role under German colonialism, even though missionaries had existed in Cameroon well before Germany annexed the territory. Associate Professor Charlotte Walker-Said of City University of New York, who has studied extensively the effects of Christianity in West Africa, says the introduction of the church was arguably the most dramatic change for Cameroonian women.
While women did not always have the power of speech in pre-colonial Africa, women were typically silent politically. They all of a sudden had a socio-cultural role that was changed with Christianity. The church offered different avenues for what they termed liberation, and to many women in Cameroon, it was indeed perceived as a liberation. I've interviewed many women, several women in their 80s and 90s in Cameroon, who indeed refused a polygamous marriage, literally escaped their villages, and fled to a church in order to seek a monogamous marriage with a Christian man. So they really were inspired by a lot of the liberating rhetoric of the church, saying, free yourself. Many women did internalize that. Whether or not the evidence can be compared about whether it was truly liberating is yet another study. But to many women, they did internalize the message of liberation, sought monogamous marriages, and also sought the many opportunities that the church offered to learn nursing. They had orphanages. They would learn kind of nursing and childcare in the orphanages. They would also learn a lot of household skills, whether it was repassage, like ironing, laundry, seamstress, or what you might call tailoring and sewing.
Walker Said says that while the church was perceived as a liberation for women, it still emphasized patriarchal authority, and divorce was highly frowned upon, and the church could not be described as a liberal organization. Historians have also pointed out that some missions in West Africa were also plagued with scandals and allegations of abuse. Yet, religion did provide an avenue for women's groups to form.
Oh, absolutely. The church was instrumental in developing many different kinds of women's groups, whether it was trade unions like Jeunesse Ouvrière Chrétienne, which is the young Christian trade union. And then there was the young Christian trade union for women, so the Jeunesse Ouvrière Chrétienne Féminine. So that was one of many. There were a number of other religious groups that women would join, whether they were Bible study groups, whether they were catechist wives groups, choirs and choruses. A lot of men joined the choirs as well. So these groups, interestingly enough, while their basis was religious, they would meet for political meetings in the 40s and 50s and 60s, again, when the sort of anti-colonial rhetoric and liberation was being discussed in the newspapers and in the political sphere. These religious groups were, in fact, very politicized in the 50s, and they became political, which you might call mouthpieces as well. They would advocate for nationalism.
By the late 1950s, there were murmurings of discontent in Cameroon, and not just about the prospect of an end to colonialism. In the Bamenda grass fields, perhaps the best-known example of female resistance in Cameroon was brewing, according to historian Confidence Ngam.
In context, in the 1950s, colonialism was driving towards the end. And we must note that one of the ways of emancipation, of empowerment of women, of asking for a space where they could speak, was brought by the colonialists themselves. And the missionaries were good vectors in empowering women. In fact, the whole history of the Com Kingdom in the 1930s, like that of the Grassfield Cameroon, had one key thing running through: the problem of women. Either the problem of women in marriage, either the problem of women in Christianity, or the problem of women who were deserting their polygamous family to seek refuge within the church.
In the Com farming community, women held sway. The German and British colonial authorities had generally stayed out of traditional women's farm work. Things were already at a tipping point when colonial officials wanted to change farming practices to maximize profits. Specifically, the new cross-contour cultivation contradicted the traditional methods favored by rural women. Rumors of increased taxation and that their land would be sold off without their consent agitated the Com farmers. And in 1958, the Com women of the Bamenda grass fields mobilized, starting the so-called Anlu Rebellion. Historically, Anlu was practiced by older women to call for order and accountability. It was especially directed at men, when the women felt that their interests were not met.
And in a traditional society like Com, where the farm was the threshold of all wealth that women had, a violation of their values in how they see the things of agriculture was what provoked the Anlu. So colonialism, political maneuvers were well in place before this time. But the fact that this one particularly concerned the farming methods made that a protest very likely.
Or as Cameroonian historian from the University of Leiden, Walter Nkui, puts it,
so after the Second World War, there was a twist in colonial policies. It was about, quote unquote, the colonial powers wanted to prove that they were good guys. And agriculture was to play a very big role. But then, because colonialism in itself is so arrogant, they failed to understand the indigenous forms, which if they could understand it, they would not have provoked these women to this level. It was about reinforcing a policy that the women did not understand.
When a representative of a local authority tried to inform the women in Ginicom about the decision, without their direct consent, The Com women surrounded his house and protested, made vulgar gestures, and the older women exposed their nudity. Their chanting and ululating would become a battle cry for women-led protests without a shot being fired. The women closed markets, schools, and administrative centers. The leaders, called Fuam and Naiwan Moana, took on the names of Queen and Divisional Officer, respectively, in mockery of the British colonial structures they were fighting against. The women fought with nudity and public indecency, set up roadblocks, and destroyed property. Local political leaders feared to meet the women. Traditional and colonial governance was crippled. Police sent to arrest Anlu leaders were intimidated and even chased away. The Com Women's Rebellion faded by early 1959, when a pro-Anlu party took power in the region. But political mobilizations by women, inspired by the Anlu, continued until 1961, when Britain relinquished control over Cameroon. Against all odds, the women's movement had prevailed.
Anlu, as a female rebellion movement, could demonstrate the level to which women in a traditional African society first has been emancipated to be able to do open protest. In fact, it showed the height to which women empowerment had taken a turn for good, and that when provoked, they could at least do open protest to distort the patriarchy that had been in reign for a very long time. Secondly, we must note this too, that the women's Anlu movement showed how politicians could be able to manipulate public opinion for their private or for their public image. And again, it taught the patriarchal system a lesson that women forever will not be taken for granted.
This special feature was brought to you by DW with support from the German Federal Foreign Office. I'm Kai Nebe.